Super. Thank you very much, Bhavani. And thank you all for being here. We have a very esteemed expert panel here today to talk about the use of blended finance or innovative finance, specifically in the wash space, which is an area that hasn't seen as much investment as we would like. Um, so I'll just set some brief context, and then we'll jump right in. So I just did a quick Google search yesterday. We're sitting in the city of Mumbai. Many of you guys have come from out of town. And when we talk about water, sanitation, hygiene, what is the situation that we're facing? So Mumbai is generating 7,000 tons of waste per day. And of this, roughly, I think 6,000 is going into the landfill. So you can do the maths. Incidentally, of the 7,000, 2,000 is construction debris and silt. Because of all the construction that's going on, that's what's causing the air pollution that we see. I also looked up the statistics from the National Health and Family Survey 2021 across the cities. Some of the things are positive. So it's showing a 99% access to improved drinking water in Mumbai. But that includes pretty much all the sources you can imagine. It shows an increase in safe menstrual hygiene practices from the last survey, from I think 80% to 90%. But guess what? On sanitation, it shows that only 60% of the citizens of Mumbai have access to a toilet. Other 40% are using dry latrines or public toilets. Only 36% of the wastewater generated in the state of Maharashtra is treated. Other is just dumped into the rivers. So we know this is an inherently complex topic, linked to infrastructure, governance, health, behavior change, and whatnot. But there are green shoots of opportunity. Circular economy is a topic that's picking up globally and locally. In Dharavi, they say 80% of the waste is recycled. The people are in Davos. The Prime Minister is talking here yesterday about life, about sustainable consumption. And we do see ULBs getting more and more interested in having this conversation, and a bunch of policy moves from the EPR regulations to NGT rulings. And therefore, we have seen an increasing interest by impact investors in WASH to some extent, in some segments, like waste management, and lesser so in others like water. So I think, with that, just to kind of talk about what are some of the 4 or 5 potential financing strategies that are there, and then we'll lay it open to the panel to walk us through their perspectives. What are the different ways that private capital can be crowded in? So I would say number 1 is equity and debt-based impact investing, right? Now this will come in only in areas which have commercially viable opportunities, and Meeta from Circulate Capital has made many of those investments. So she'll share with us more on that. I've been fortunate to make one investment with them when I was at Asha in a company called Nepra Waste Management, but there's many others. The second is results-based financing. Anushri from British Asia Trust, they've been leaders in this area, in the area of education, skilling, and others. But what is the potential of that potentially in waste management, either as outcome funders from government or ULBs, or donors interested in WASH subventing interest? Then there are other blended finance structures beyond impact bonds. Apoor from USAID has led many of those discussions that have happened on using guarantees, risk mitigation mechanisms, concessional capital, to build in the appropriate viability. And then frankly, larger climate finance issues, green bonds, carbon credits, and so forth. So what is really the status of financing in the WASH space? What are these tools that can be brought to bear? So with that, let's just dive right in. So first, I'd like to ask Nutan from RTI if you can briefly talk about what your organization does and give us an overall market context for what is happening in the WASH financing landscape.
Thank you so much. I'm Nutan, and at RTI International, our job is to really bring stakeholders together, act as a facilitator where we can create projects with the aim and ambition of enhancing private sector finance. So with that said, I really want to start with a bold sentence over here, and that's in Hindi, which says that "Jab tak suraj chand rahega, wash market tu बढ़ता ही रहेगा." And I truly, truly mean that. If you look from an India perspective, India really needs around $192 billion till 2030. 30% of that is expected to come from public sector and 70% of that is expected to come from the private sector. But if you see the last 10 years, 15 years, what has happened? The government are trying to be busy in terms of doing their own work. The investors feels government are too scary and are not trying to forge partnerships. But I would say things are changing, things are evolving. If I'll tell you, under Amrut, government is really putting pressure on all cities to go for PPP projects. I can also say that the government is really creating a healthy competition among the cities on enhancing their KPIs on infrastructure development. And I think cities are smart enough. They know they can't do it alone. They need collaboration. They need to partner with private sector entities. And I think that is the change. I would also see a change coming from donors like USAID, DFAT, and many others who are trying to forge this partnership. And the last and the most important thing I would like to say is water and wastewater as a sector, the price point that it never got earlier, it is going to get now, and it is getting now. For a very simple reason is ESG has picked up, and I think someone in the last session spoke about it. Industries do not have water, and India is water scarce. So if India has to achieve its $5 trillion of economy in the next 1 year or 2 years, every drop of water has to be recycled, has to be reused. And that is what, when I say water and wastewater, I would say that that's the blue and the black gold that India has, and I would urge my investors to come forward and look at that market. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Coming to you, Mita, as one of the few and most well-known investors in the circularity space, Circulate Capital, I think, has made investments in India and other emerging markets. Could you share with us a little bit about your investment thesis and specific success stories in this space, and what drew you into this space, and what are some of the challenges that you've seen being addressed that is making this a viable investment area?
Thanks, Karthik. Nutan, I completely agree what you said on the government side. And 2019, when we were setting up Circulate Capital, I still remember the only thing that we could think about was collection. And then we thought to ourselves, okay, does that really work? And collaborating with the government. We said, you know what, we are more risk capital, and we have the best of investors. So Coke, Pepsi, Unilever, Danone, CP Chem, Mondelez, and P&G, they're all our investors. And we just thought to ourselves, okay, let's actually use this capital and invest in collection, recycling, and digitization. And then we could see the output that comes out. So in collection, we have two of the companies, which is Nepra and Recycle, which even does digitization. But we have the largest portfolio in Southeast Asia on recycling, because that is where we felt the crux lies. Today, as Circulate Capital, we are the most circular economy fund for no other reason but, when these companies, we look at them, we fund them, and our investors are the ones who can actually use this end product. So imagine the beauty of a fund that can go in, invest in collection companies. Those collection companies can give the waste to the recycling companies. These recycling companies are upcycling the waste and then providing it to investors who are using it for end products. Who could do that better than us? And we just worked on that thesis and said, you know what? Let's build a portfolio like this. So today we have the largest portfolio in India of 7 companies. And out of these, we're just trying to now build more into it. So 2019, we didn't have any company who was trying to raise capital on a sizable size, apart from Nepra, where we invested, Karthik, together. And we just kept on looking, and we found that we have to go the MSME route and risk our capital, even if you're putting in $5 million by $500,000, $1 million, and then upping it up every 6-7 months. So there was no track record also out here. So if you look at the space as a whole, especially in the plastic waste recycling, we had no companies, unorganized sector, no track record. So how can you expect anyone to fund them? And it only takes a fund which is, in a more circular way, working with these companies to do something like that. And that's how we build this portfolio. And today, thanks to building this portfolio, we have so many DFIs wanting to work with them. One of our investee companies is actually talking to one of the best DFIs in the sector, and they're looking at investing debt in them now. And that is proof that this model works. Our first investee company was just 1,000 tons when we invested. Today, they're 30,000 tons in a span of 2.5 years. And that is in flexible space, which is the most difficult to recycle. But the technology was provided, the capital was provided, and even the end consumer was provided. And that is the way we went about with doing these investments and coming up with the 7 portfolio companies that we have today.
Super. Thank you so much. Moving on from that to now see that how can we fund more such business models? I should have mentioned at the beginning, right, that we are kind of including waste management here as part of WASH, but WASH is actually, as you know, a combination of pretty tricky sectors, right? You have water, which again has a bunch of things going on in it, from sourcing to purification, networks, delivery, packaging, etc. Toilets and hygiene, which again have got build, operations, public toilets, community toilets, toilet tech, hygiene, sanitation and wastewater, right? FSM, sewage treatment, industrial, stormwater, etc. And solid waste management. And we have seen that in areas like solid waste management, where you've had positive regulations, Swachh Bharat, and business model evolution, behavior change, investments have happened. But in some of these other areas, they haven't. But we saw that in other sectors in the past as well. Education and skilling, to name a few, where also there's a state subject, also there's a role for the government to play, also there's a need for huge capex. GOI, as part of Swachh Bharat and Jal Jeevan mission, estimated, I have the figure here somewhere, 300 billion over 3,000 projects. And as Nutan was saying, 70% of this capital has to come from the private sector. So the question is to Anushri that after 5 or 6 years or more of hard work and building this blended finance market in the education and skilling space, I guess we'll come to the lessons for WASH specifically later, but can you just share with us what were the key lessons in unlocking blended capital and working with government?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me here. So the British Asian Trust so far in India has launched, and in fact we've just wrapped up not just the country's but the world's largest development impact bond in education. This was a 4-year project and it delivered fantastic results. We then launched in 2021 a development impact bond, which is $14.4 million, targeting 50,000 youth or young people with a target of almost 60% women. And this is in vocational education and technical and vocational education, which is the TVET ecosystem. And we are working on our third tool, which is an outcomes fund, which we hope to launch soon in the next academic year, again on foundational literacy and numeracy. Now, over the years, as we have actually developed a track record in impact bonds, I think the first thing I want to say, Karthik, is we're not married to impact bonds, right? We're not married to any instrument. As an approach, we've always been problem first, impact first, right? And that's the first lesson we've learned in our work through the years. What is the problem that you're trying to solve? What type of capital does that problem require, right? So even if it's WASH, right? Are you trying to solve affordability for your end consumer or customer or beneficiary, which requires very different type of financing approach? Are you trying to solve working capital requirements for service providers, especially for-profit service providers, who actually in the WASH ecosystem you find quite a few, right? That requires a very different approach, tool, type of capital. Are you actually trying to solve for the local authorities or the ULBs, where you're saying that they have limited funding, so let's help them use that funding in a more efficient, effective way? Are you trying to help them actually support, do price discovery and find innovative models? That requires a very different tool. So sort of long story short, I think we've always been problem first, and that's the first thing I would say, even when we try applying the principles of results-based funding to the WASH ecosystem. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway for us really has been fit-for-purpose instruments. the most common criticisms you find around outcome-based financing is these bonds take too long to develop, there's a long gestation and design time, the transaction costs are high. As we do more and more of them, we have actually realized how to optimize for all of this. And the more we do them, the critical mass that we kind of achieve with these, there will be economies of scale that will come, right? So it's not a given, it's symptomatic of any early market where you're trying to develop a tool. This is bound to happen, but I think we're already seeing in all our impact bonds, we've actually capped transaction cost, non-programmatic cost, including evaluation, design, legal, etc., to around 20%, right? So very, very different from the early prototypes you had with Educate Girls. And the market is evolving on that, right? So that's the second piece, that create fit-for-purpose tools. If it means that your first year is grant funded, you use that year as a learning year to actually gather the data, the benchmark, the price discovery you want to do, the testing that you want to do. That can be done as a grant-funded year. You don't need to launch a DIB, but do that and do your design simultaneously, optimize on your design. The third one, which I think is also going to be very relevant to WASH, is we have always played a market making role, and as a market maker or as that ecosystem developer, we've realized that supply of organizations, we call them service providers, they're implementation partners, non-profits, for-profits, all types of social organizations who actually help deliver these services on ground, that really needs to be strengthened. We have the usual 10, 15 large service providers in health, in education and livelihoods who will become part of these instruments. These instruments do require a level of rigor, a level of performance, because money only exchanges hands when results get delivered, and results are outcomes, they're not inputs or activities, right? And for social organizations to be able to deliver at that scale, at that price point, with that efficiency, to use data to drive their decisions, it is quite challenging, and so a lot of investment needs to be made in improving their capacity. And the last point is around government, and I'll circle back to this maybe in a bit, but if you look at outcome-based financing, the ideal case scenario is that the government basically is an outcome funder. The government is procuring services and only paying if these services get delivered. That's how it's typically evolved in the West. In India, we all know there are very practical challenges for the government, any type of government body, to come in as an outcome funder. And while there is sort of a parallel ecosystem that's working on policy change, on regulatory and legislative change, what do we do in the interim, right? And so in our education work, we are actually thinking of doing a systems change development impact bond. So the government doesn't pay for it. We leverage the scheme, that's the Nippon Bharat scheme that the government already has. We show the government through a development impact bond, how do you actually implement a scheme that you already have better, more efficiently, get bang for your buck, right? And the investment required, the money required is already available. So your development impact bond is actually just doing a systems change piece working with state governments. That's one way of doing it. In our skills impact bond, we have NSDC, which is a quasi-government financing organization, come in as a risk investor. So again, the first impact bond in the world where a government body is actually participating as a risk investor. And given what NSDC is, today it is the quality, it's the apex body for setting quality standards for vocational programs, vocational schemes and policies. It becomes much easier to mainstream the findings, right? The intent is not to keep doing a DIB after a DIB, right? Nobody wants to do that. But how do you mainstream the findings, and having somebody like an NSDC be a risk investor, look at it from such close quarters, really helps that agenda. So I think those are the 4 key takeaways, and we can obviously discuss the application to the WASH ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Anushree. That's really, really helpful and articulates it perfectly. And that sets it up for me to now come to Apurv, because USAID has done so much amazing work in the sector. And exactly as Anushree put it, right? Not married to the instrument, but to the problem, and figuring out the proper fit-purpose instrument. So could you share with us a little bit of some of the work that's happened in WASH, the different instruments that have been used, and the relative successes of these approaches?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Karthik, and thanks so much AVP and for putting this panel together and putting this crowd together. This is probably the first time I've seen so many people for a wash session. It's typically not been a sector of interest for people, so I'm really glad to see this audience. Um, Before that, maybe let me say a couple of things to some of the comments that were made earlier. Uh, Anushri, to your point, I think all the problems that you highlighted exist at some scale or the other in the wash sector, and I think you need different types of solutions, instruments to solve that. And maybe just doubling down on what Nutan said in terms of the market, absolutely. I think 190 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion, all numbers which significantly need to be filled, significant investment need to come to fill that gap, and that's not currently happening. I think what Government of India did tremendously over the last 7-8 years is really give a push and impetus to the sector. I mean, uh, 11 crore toilets were built in the last 7 to 8 years, and you've built the toilets, you've given that access to toilet, but to what Karthik said, I think that whole value chain of water and getting that water to the toilet, and getting the wastewater from the toilet to actually being treated and then used. I think that's where gaps still exist, and a lot more needs to happen. And I think that's where MSMEs will play a key role going forward. Enterprises will play a key role going forward, and that's where financial products still are very underdeveloped. There's little investment that's being made, even by banks, NBFCs. The toilet loan, household loans, that's still a product that's fairly well figured out by the MFIs and banks. So with that, let me talk about what we as USA do when it comes to private sector engagement. And I think John set it up very well in the last session on our overall work in WASH. But to complement that, we take a four-pronged approach when it comes to private sector engagement in WASH. One, supporting high-risk innovations, very early-stage innovations through grants. We do that through a host of different mechanisms, development innovation ventures, which is a rolling call for applications. We've used Millennium Alliance, which was a multi-stakeholder platform in the past to support WASH innovations, etc. Second, and very importantly, and I think something that was mentioned earlier as well by Meeta, that enterprise capacity building to make them investable, scalable through different technical assistance work. Thirdly, working on de-risking, catalyzing private capital, bank capital, equity capital, debt capital into the space through different blended finance instruments. And lastly, but equally importantly, working on the enabling environment, working in collaboration with governments at all levels to help with policy and regulations that could help enterprise and private capital thrive. And I'll just zoom into the third one, which is the instruments, right? So in WASH, we've used two instruments. Like I said, it's still, the market, I'd say like the bulk of the market, the MSME market, is still fairly nascent. So I wouldn't be able to share a lot of success stories yet, but there's a lot of hope that we'll get there soon. So we've used two instruments broadly. One, which again John touched upon a little bit, is our credit guarantee instrument, where we work with local financial institutions, give them a risk cover to help them bridge the gap between perceived and actual risk. Couple that with some bit of technical assistance on, broad knowledge for the lenders on the sector, but also technical assistance to enterprises to help them become more investable. Again, with the idea that this leads to a long-term market building for these financial institutions. So currently we have 3 facilities, one with a large bank focusing on the SME segment, the large infrastructure projects lending to them. We have one with a mid-sized NBFC to focus on startup and really some bit of micro enterprise lending as well. And then we have a small facility with a very small NBFC to really lend to your very, very, like, what we call nano enterprises these days, sanitary ware, traders, that whole value chain. And we've had mixed success. Still, these facilities are very new. We've been trying to push utilization on that. Second, and realizing that there are so many different problems, not one instrument is going to solve that is we've been working with Intellicap to set up a blended finance fund to get financing to MSMEs. And this fund, what it will do is it will combine, it will blend grant and debt capital to do two or three things. One, offer concessional finance to MSMEs. And second, through the grants, provide technical assistance for MSMEs to become more investable. And we've used these models before in numerous sectors. We've seen a lot of success. This is still a new and nascent sector, and I think that's where coming together of different types of stakeholders, collaboration between different type of stakeholders can really push the needle and get the sector moving.
Super. This is great. We did have a second round of questions planned, but just in the interest of time, I also wanted to just check if there's any questions in the audience. Yes, Adit. Yes, sir. Maybe we can take two quick questions, and then I'll also frame mine. We've got about 10 more minutes for this.
So this is an area where at least I had attempted to see how much could be done, and as much as I tried to, there were a lot of challenges to get things off ground. My specific question is that where do you see the role which corporates and private sector can play in helping this catalyze together? And at least what I've seen so far is that they've not been as active as they could be. But if there is a role which they could play, and if it could be a win-win for all.
Super, thank you. And I think there was a question here in the front.
Anand Iyer, Janagraha. Anushri, your points about the third track of are you trying to help the cities, the local bodies. Now, that's infrastructure provision. They do not have too much of a handle on, it's not remunerative. Unless it is captively sent to someone, say an industry, or you cannot, the user and sanitation charges or whatever, water and sanitation charges aren't enough actually to make it entirely profitable. So any examples that you have would be so relevant in helping local bodies discover the price that you mentioned.
Super. Does anyone want to address those two specific questions? And then we'll do a last round of closing specifically on your closing points. Yes, please. Anyone?
So I'll just answer, I think that was Al's question on role of corporate and private sector. And I think in the development impact space, when we think of the corporate sector, the first thing that comes to mind is CSR. We forget that companies actually have a much, much larger role to play as just responsible businesses in the society, right? So if I think of companies or corporates, I think there are multiple ways in which they can actually promote this agenda. I think first is obviously through CSR, which is a small part, but just using that 2% more creatively, more innovatively, just using that a little more catalytically. And I think the regulations are going in a direction which allows them to now participate in some of these blended finance instruments. The other sort of obviously no-brainer area for me is just through their supply chains, right? Because a lot of these small businesses, MSMEs that Apurva was talking about, they eventually end up in supply chains of larger businesses, or either they are vendors or they're providing these services to them. And if we can actually get companies to source or contract in a slightly more socially, environmentally responsible way, and I think ESG is actually putting that pressure on them, the reporting in public, the pressure that they are getting from investors. So I'm hopeful that that will also sort of catch up. The third way is obviously, like Amita said, actually investors, right, like LPs in some of these funds, and also acting as sort of consumers of these products, right? So I think there's a lot that the corporate sector can do, actually beyond just sort of the philanthropic capital that they have as CSR. On the point around ULB, unfortunately, I don't have any examples, and I was hoping that Janagra could actually shed light, and I was hoping to obviously attend your panel, but just to say that, the points that you've raised are very valid, but the point I was trying to make is that sometimes when we think of government participation in some of these tools, we tend to typecast them, right? So we're saying outcome funding, contract for this, without realizing that there are other ways in which they can participate or other ways in which we can actually catalyze and help them, right? So like I was saying, if it is really about, say, supporting innovative technologies and not having the risk appetite or the capital to be able to do that, that's an area where something like an impact bond could definitely help, right? But truly sort of, your points around just money being scarce and them not having the means to raise that, so.
I think Meeta had a point to share on the ULBs.
So I'll add to what Anushri is saying, and your points are really valid, Anushri. But there is this one bit that people say, what can corporates do? I think the proof is right in front of everyone in this room right now. I mean, the corporates that we had, the 9 of them, invested in a third-party fund, believed with the fact that this fund can do something, and you have across India and Southeast Asia 11 investments, and in India 7 of them. So this is something which was innovative, new, risk capital, and the beauty of this entire model is that whatever they put in, the material has got collected, it's got recycled, there's capacity which is built, and they are the end users of it. Not all of it today, but I'm hoping once the regulation does come in 24, 25, our companies can stand right at the forefront and say, you have this regulation, and we have the material. Now let's work together more. On the other hand, somebody talked about ULBs. There are 2 beautiful examples I would like to demonstrate out here. One was the NEPRA one, wherein they worked with the governments, and they are paying the money for even getting this waste. And the model is such that, you recover whatever you can through the dry waste centers and the MRFs, and then you provide this material to recyclers. Imagine if your paper, metal, plastic is so well sorted and doesn't go to the landfill and goes to the right recycler. What more could you be asking for? Because that is where wealth is waste. Your entire waste is wealth today. And that is what, NEPRA does believe in. Another very good example is, we are asking all our companies to integrate backwards. Lucro, it recycles the most difficult to recycle flexible waste. We asked them to open collection centers. They have 13 collection centers across India. But the beautiful thing happened was last month when the Baramati government gave them a parcel of land and said, this is 20 acres of land. Now use this. You set up a small sorting center because you guys have a plant in Umargaon and all the waste comes in there. And this is plastic waste. So that plastic waste is going to get sorted out there. The ULB is going to drop the segregated waste which is there, the dry waste. This company is going to sort it and use it into their plant. So if governments in small tier 2, tier 3 cities can do this, because there's land available out there, you have a completely new ecosystem and a supply chain which is getting developed, which is more traceable, which never happened in the past. And that is what we are working with all our 7 companies, go backward in the supply chain, understand and make it more traceable so that when you're selling it to an organized player, you have a differentiated strategy out there and the government also participates with you. So that is what we are working on right now. Let's see what we come up with new in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much. We're nearly out of time, but I'll request each of you, maybe starting with Apurv, to share some closing thoughts as to where do you really see this waste financing ecosystem heading. What are the challenges that need to be addressed? If you have any policy asks or market asks, but a message to leave with the investors who are on the sidelines thinking about entering this space. And just in closing, I'll simply say this, right, that wash and waste are basically a perfect example of tri-sector collaboration. They talk about Sarkar, Samaj, Bazaar, right? Markets, government, society. And I'm saying this from personal experience and much less experience than any of the folks on the panel, but having made 1 or 2 investments in this space and with HNIs, who are sector agnostic. And people are like, who's going to invest in waste management as a venture capitalist? Why aren't we investing in tech? And this is the reason. Because Sarkar was the government push. the Prime Minister pushing Swachh Bharat, but specific regulations, EPR, National Green Tribunal actually handing out fines for people who are not doing bulk waste generation. So there's like a push. Then at the societal level, the awareness of sustainability, climate change, behavioral change. People are now actually buying wooden toothbrushes and thinking about these issues, right? And that's reflected in the NGOs who work with slums, who work with poor people to actually enable behavior change and help them, even collecting waste and so on. And third is the private sector, where they see returns being made. So when these three forces come together, you actually see change start to happen. So I think there's a lot of potential here, and there's certainly a lot of ULBs asking about involvement in wash transactions. I know AVPN itself is talking to several of them, and thank you guys for doing that and setting those platforms up. So I think this is a very, very exciting space, and we're very lucky to have a few other panels today going deeper into this topic. But specifically from an investment lens, could I please ask you guys to share what's the parting message you want to leave with any investor, particularly an impact investor, who's considering investing in the wash ecosystem?
Thanks. Adit, let's catch up separately also. I did have a couple of other examples to give you on the corporate engagement that we've been able to unlock in the wash sector specifically, but I'll not spend too much time on that. I think in terms of taking the sector to the next level from an investment standpoint, I think let's look at two things that we need to keep chipping away at. One is ease of investment. Second is ease of doing business, right? So one from an investor's lens, one from an enterprise or an MSME lens. On the ease of investment side, I think all the different challenges that Anushri touched upon, they're all very real, and they all need different tailored de-risking solutions. So, there's credit guarantee, there's concessional finance, there's room for so many more different or similar kinds of instruments that need to be scaled up. So that's one area I think we need to work more on de-risking investors. Secondly, I think very importantly, and I think that's where these kind of conferences, convenings play a big role, is investor education, right? How many circulate capitals are there? How many water equities are there, right? There's too few investors in this market right now. There's hardly any equity investment happening. There's very few banks, NBFCs that have made sustainable products out of this market, and education is a big part of that. There's little understanding of what different kinds of models exist. How can you approach them? How can you underwrite them? So I think all those need to happen, and they need to happen not just at the senior management level, and I'm talking specifically from banks and NBFCs. It also needs to happen at the very bottom, where people are actually going out and sourcing those deals, underwriting those deals. The other piece is what I earlier mentioned is MSME capacity building. So a lot of the times people are, or banks who are even interested, or NBFCs who are even interested in lending, they're not able to lend because these enterprises are not investable. So I think a lot of work needs to be done there as well. And I think one last thing on the investability side, maybe an aspirational thing, to really put the spotlight on the wash MSME space, maybe this needs to come under RBI priority sector lending guidelines as well, which it does not currently, right? On the ease of doing business side, that's more on the enterprise side. How can we improve, the interaction between that nexus of government and enterprise, right? Because government is going to continue being the biggest off-taker in this sector. How do you build capacity, or how do you continue building capacity of ULB officials? How do you make procurement simpler for private enterprises? How do you help ULB officials engage more efficiently with the players? How do you improve financial health of ULBs to be able to pay enterprises on time? And so I think both on the ease of doing business side, where you have to work a lot more on the enabling environment, and on the investment side, we need to continue chipping on that. And I think I want to put myself and USAID out there to say that whoever here in this audience and otherwise wants to come to us, we are happy to collaborate, happy to partner, to really nudge this space to scale. Right now it's too small, too nascent, but there's a lot of market potential.
Sure. So I think +1 to everything Apurva said. I think that could be the quickest close. But I just want to top that off with an example. And this was in 2017, so pre-Jal Jeevan sort of mission was introduced, right? And I was working with a social enterprise, a social business in the clean drinking water space, where they did filtration, community-based filtration plants and water ATMs, right? And the whole idea was that you find a village entrepreneur who actually wants to take up a franchisee, and then you help them set up the plant. They recover the cost by selling the water, and they run the plant. Now, obviously, this enterprise had working capital issues because the nature of the business is such that it requires longer gestation, margins are small, communities don't pay on time, etc., etc. So back in 2017, 2018, we decided to basically see if they could get a loan, right? And I mean, after racking our brains, working capital, FLDG, we actually went and we secured an FLDG for this enterprise from an international foundation. And these were pre sort of CSR amendment days, so CSR couldn't do FLDGs, and we tried convincing a lot of companies. And the first question was, right, but my philanthropic money is going to help a bank and sort of, repay the bank. How is that doing any good? So I think we crossed that hurdle, raised an FLDG, went to a commercial bank, told them, showed them the business model, showed them the entire balance sheet, told them we have an FLDG. They just couldn't understand the business model. They just couldn't understand how do you actually assess risk and value risk and return in a model like this? What are your benchmarks? What are your price discovery? Why are your margins so small? Obviously, I'm selling water. There is a cap on the margins I can earn, right? Eventually, obviously, we didn't get the loan. The bank did say that if you can actually improve your revenue generation potential, right? So think of value-added services. And the enterprise did come up with a few ideas. So we said, okay, we'll start selling cold water in summers and charge a premium for that, right? For that, they needed a chiller at the community level, which was costing too much. They then said, okay, can we maybe start doing dispensing water in smaller quantities because margins are better there? So instead of doing liters, can we do smaller 200, 500 ml? For that, you needed to make design changes to the actually machine. We didn't have the capital to do that, right? So we kind of kept going round in circles. I think the limited point I'm trying to make is, Apurva, everything that you said. Investor education, we wish we had the risk investment there who upfront would give us this kind of working capital. Education with the banks, the NBFCs, these are not your business as usual models. I still understand plastic and waste, which is very visible, but when you start looking at sanitation, FSM, drinking water, essentially the markets don't work very well there. There is a degree of public service that is involved there. So I think to be able to understand and work with these models, and I think the second point that I want to stress on is technical assistance, which obviously, USAID does, a few other organizations in the country do, and we massively undervalue the importance of this kind of money, whether it's technical assistance that goes to the enterprise directly and helps them improve unit economics or efficiencies, whether it's technical assistance that is aimed towards, your lenders and your financial institutions, or it's aimed towards ULBs, right? So my two kind of ask, and I think it's a collective responsibility, it's not any one person or organization's kind of role, is a lot of investor donor education, and then thinking of technical assistance as that kind of, that key to unlock more blended finance.
Just one line from my end. People have heard about e-commerce. Guys, next 100 years, you're going to hear about e-commerce, you're going to hear about water commerce, you're going to hear about wastewater commerce. That's going to stay. Thank you.
Two things from my side. One is I completely second Apurva's comment on priority sector lending. I think if the wash sector can get that, especially I see this as a personal challenge in all the companies that we have. Banks don't understand what Anushri was saying. I completely second even what her experiences are. So priority sector lending is one bit. And second, I think as funds are taking so much risk and investing equity in these companies and they're growing, I think now it's time for the DFIs to set up. Okay, now step up and start looking at, a model like Baramati, which is for Lucro, or an EPRA. And there's so much more that, we could be working with, because now they're completely de-risk models. The groundwork was done when we said, we're going to be investing in them, growing them from 1,000 to 30,000. There is proof that the model works. I think now there is more debt capital, blended finance that's required, and working collaboratively with, at least with some funds, I think new models can come up and this sector can change as a whole. So that is my ask.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the amazing insights, and thank you for AVPN for hosting us. So with that, we'll close this panel. If you could just give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.